On this podcast of Angie on the Road to Recovery, we're going to talk about links and how links can bring flashbacks of past disturbing, unwanted memories. Now, here's Angie via telephone with our host, William Lee, on this podcast of Angie on the Road to Recovery.
Hi, Angie.
Oh, hi, Bill. How are you?
Really good, and we're glad to have you back on the phone with us on the show today. And I kind of sat back and I thought to myself, I'd like to find out a little bit more about the triggering mechanism that some people have when it comes to subconsciously trying to put their feelings back in their minds and how they balance out reality from today's reality from yesterday's past. Can you kind of give us an idea of how this works?
Well, yes. I mean, I feel like I get triggered a lot. I mean, just yesterday, for instance, driving around in the same neighborhood, that the abuse happened and having to go to places that remind me of the past, that can be very triggering. But then definitely the use of my positive self-talk to remind myself that was in the past. It's not now. It can't happen anymore. Does that make sense? So
the area that you went back to, is that relatively close to where you're living now?
Yes. I really live close to the area that I grew up in. It's just a little bit down the road.
How does that make you feel? How inside you, knowing that happened and knowing that you have a new life now? And if so, how do you handle, you said, positive thinking? How does that work?
It depends. There are times when it depends on if it's a good day or a bad day. You know what I mean? As far as symptoms go from the PTSD, there are days where, I'm very resilient. In fact, as I go further along in recovery, that continues. But then there are days that, like when you're having a bad day, we all have a bad day sometimes. And on those days, the triggering might have a little bit more of an impact. So there are times when it's a good day and I can be very, kind of matter of fact inside about it, not so emotional about it, but just like, oh yeah, that's a trigger, no big deal. And then there are other days where I might be stressed out or something else is going on emotionally where I might be a little bit more tense or anxious. And the use of positive self-talk is just saying to yourself things that are positive about the trigger. So you can say things like, that trigger is just a trigger and it's in the past and it's about something that has already happened. The trauma is not happening now. So definitely separating out the past from the present.
And this gives you I would assume then, a calming of the mind, realizing that you can take control of the situation, that you don't have to be scared. You're back into a positive, secure outlook and attitude. Am I pretty close?
Yes, exactly. And I've even said things like that when I'm talking about, some of the trauma. I'm not scared anymore. I used to not even be able to really be outside by myself, outside of my own home. And that's simply not the case anymore. I'm at a place in my recovery where that fear is not there most of the time. I can't say 100% of the time, but most of the time.
Now that you've moved on and you've got a good outlook and you're building that positive, I would guess, triggering mechanism that cancels out the bad stuff. Well, I'm going to use the word bad stuff in this term, but cancels out the actual feelings that you have of fear when you go into something that reminds you of the past. Now that you've got that under control, and I understand now that you're remarried very happily, and it's been just a few years since you've been married, how does an individual that goes through this type of trauma, how do they relate to their now mate, and how do they work it out so that the fears of the past don't come back and interfere with the marriage that you're currently in, or the lifestyle that you're currently in, I should say?
Yes, that can be tricky sometimes. For instance, yesterday I had to do something that brought up a lot of trauma from the past. I had to refile for a protection order against my abuser that I had thought stuck legally, but it did not. So I had to go redo that. And it did bring up a lot. And it wasn't necessarily the fear that I took out on my husband, poor guy, but it was some anger, and it was what happens with this stuff is the trauma symptoms and everything is that everything's amplified, and so like it's pretty typical to have an overreaction to something that your partner does, and so
Sure.
that's kind of what happened yesterday. And this morning, after it was near time for sleep, so this morning we discussed it, and I had explained, I had to go file that order, and so you just kind of you talk your way through it, and you and then of course it's good for your partner to have some kind of support. I'm a therapist, and so I understand how this works. Like the typical person who hasn't had any therapy might not have this level of insight, and so anyway, we just talk our way through it, and I explained that, of course, apologize for my overreaction to something that was said or something that triggered some of those emotions from the past, and then try to plan for the future. And that's the next thing that I was going to talk about is if you know that you're going to be triggered, or that there might be a possible trigger due to whatever you have to go somewhere that reminds you of some place that abuse occurred, or be around certain people or situations or that kind of thing. You can plan ahead, and so that you can try to mitigate any impact of what might come out of that emotionally. So
I would imagine that when you have a family get together, or even if you get together with old friends and stuff of that nature, that there's areas that would immediately start to trigger you. How do you adjust to that in a family situation or a good friend gathering? How do you compensate without having that trigger hit right away and start being kind of grumpy with the people that you're around?
Yeah, well, I think I do some mental preparation, that might include some of my positive affirmations, and then some meditation. Those are some coping skills that I would use before those kinds of events. And I do energy healing work, as you know, and so I would include a lot of that. And then I'm a spiritual person, so I lean into that as well. And then the other thing is you can kind of plan pragmatically, okay, if I start to have these feelings inside, I can excuse myself and go outside, you know what I mean, and go get some fresh air, or have a backup plan of, if you're that uncomfortable, you can leave the situation, and you can explain it to your loved ones too.
So it gives you complete control to a certain point, and that security that you need. Self-confidence, I imagine, is something that's very important to what you're doing, and being able to balance out daily life with the trauma that you've gone through, with the triggers. That must be a real juggling act to be able to really set forth. What kind of a mind do you have to express to yourself? What kind of a picture do you have to do to balance all that? Is it through just your meditation and through your spiritual beliefs, the help that you've received so far? And if so, this is kind of a two-sided question. If so, how would you, and because I know that you work with people now that have gone through this trauma, how do you get that focus point to them so that they can use this tool?
I practice what I preach. I haven't always done that. That's kind of a joke in the counselor world, but I make it part of my daily structure. There has to be the morning meditation, and then the prayers that I use, and the intention setting, and I do energy healing work as well for myself. So I do self-reiki, and I do that for some of my clients. I teach some of my clients the reiki, but I teach them and create for them these meditations too. And the other coping skills like the positive self-talk, and you had mentioned self-confidence, which is huge. There's people who have gone through this have huge self-esteem issues, and I still struggle with it, even myself sometimes. And so I have daily affirmations that I say to myself every day, and then I help my clients to create the same for themselves. And the repetition and the consistency is where you're going to see the results, the positive results.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel that you are now, making 10 the best you've ever been, and 1 the terrible time that you've already had? Where would you find yourself now on that scale?
Well, and this scale can fluctuate, so I would say probably about an 8. I'm really pleased with having gotten past a lot of the fearfulness. That was with me for a really long time, and so I feel really good about having gotten past that. I think what comes up a lot more as far as a negative emotion would probably be the anger, and so it's important to have an outlet for that. And so I do some different things to release some of that anger, and physical exercise is really important, for your overall health, but that can be a good outlet for the anger too. And then just kind of writing angry letters and burning them, as a way of letting go. And then the other thing you can do with anger, I think, is, channel it. And that's a little bit about what we're doing right here, is really educating, just really educating just the general public about what this is and how it impacts people.
It is very important for sure. Now, the last question I'm going to ask you today, Angie, is do you feel that in time you'll be able to face your accusers and the ones that have caused you such hardness in life and forgive them and walk away from them and cancel them out of your mind?
Yes, absolutely.
I want to thank you very much, Angie, for taking the time to talk with us today.
Okay, thank you so much for listening.
Have a great day, and we'll talk to you again. Bye-bye.
Okay, you too, Bill. Bye.
This concludes this podcast of Angie on the Road to Recovery. In the next few weeks, we'll be asking Angie to come back and visit with us some more so that we can discuss areas of personal relationships with your family and a host of other questions that concern how to recover from such a tragic start in life. Until then, I'm William Lee. Remember, always keep us smiling.